Welcome to Talkless Water, the podcast that takes a deep dive into the world of water with those making waves. My name is Todd Bottler, and I'm your host for Talkless Water. I'm also the principal of Collaborative Water Resolution, through which I conduct water research, provide facilitation and mediation services and training, and provide recruiting services for water executives. You can find out more about Collaborative Water Resolution at waterdisputes.org. My guest today is Professor John Nielsen-Gammon. John Nielsen-Gammon has been on the faculty at Texas A&M University since 1991. He's currently a Regents Professor of Atmospheric Sciences and also serves as the Texas State Climatologist and Director of the Southern Regional Climate Center. He graduated from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology with a PhD in 1990. John does research on various types of extreme weather, from droughts to floods, as well as air pollution and computer modeling. As the Texas State Climatologist, he helps the state of Texas make the best possible use of weather and climate information through applied research, outreach, and service on state-level committees. John is also a fellow of the American Meteorological Society. John, welcome to Talkless Water. It's great to have you. And I always like to start out with my guests to kind of find out, when they thought that water would either be the focus or a big part of their careers. And so when did you realize that?
Well, I got involved in meteorology and following the weather back in grade school. I'd be interested in different things. Weather seemed interesting. I decided, well, I'll talk my parents into getting a weather station, and I'll take weather observations. And if after a year's worth of weather observations it wasn't boring by that point, it would probably stay interesting. And so it proved, even though weather in California can be kind of boring.
Well, I guess it can be, yeah. The weather, for the most part, I mean, it wasn't recently, but in Texas in the summer, it can be kind of boring with a lot of very hot days with not a whole lot of cloud cover. Unfortunately, we had something very different not that long ago, which we'll talk about in detail as we get into the program today. As I mentioned when I was reading your bio, one of your titles is the Texas State Climatologist. And I had a little bit in your bio about what that role entails, but can you tell us more about that? Because I think
Sure,
most
yeah.
Texans would not even know that we have a state climatologist.
That tended to be the case until around 2011, when we had our biggest drought on single-year drought on record. We had massive wildfire outbreak, Bassett wildfire. Governor Perry was running for president at the time, and so there was a great deal of interest, political or otherwise, in what was going on with Texas climate. So that sort of put me on the radar, so to speak. And I do a lot of talking as climatologist to the press, answering press inquiries about whatever the latest weather or climate topic is. I do a lot of talks to organizations that care about weather and climate, such as farmers and ranchers, water suppliers, so forth. We coordinate input to the United States Drought Monitor, which is the main tool for representing drought severity across the United States, and also get used for things like drought relief funding for ranchers if they're being impacted by drought. We track the climate of Texas on a daily, weekly basis, submit regular reports, and do research on weather and climate issues that affect the state of Texas.
It sounds like it's almost a full-time job. I mean, there's a lot that you covered there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a faculty member, so basically half of my time is teaching, half is research, and half is being state climatologist, which unfortunately doesn't add up, but
Right.
That's life. Having the Southern Regional Climate Center hosted here at Texas A&M has helped a great deal, because that comes with funding from NOAA that's enabled us to to hire research faculty and research staff, and also support undergraduate and graduate students. And they're available as needed to help out with Texas climate issues as well, so we can take advantage of the economies of scale there.
So, just kind of thinking about your role as climatologist and a professor, who's studied the climate of Texas, how can you characterize what changes you've seen, if any, over the last 20 years or so?
Well, I've been in Texas for 34 years now, so um, the biggest change I noticed specifically was the first few years I was here. We'd have a shower most afternoons in the summertime, and I thought that was normal. But that turned out to be sort of the wettest period of time in the past 125 years for the state of Texas.
Hmm.
And then I had to get used to dry summers, unfortunately. But that wasn't necessarily climate change acting. That was natural variability. We have a lot of swings from year to year and decade to decade in the state of Texas. So, in that context, I don't notice climate change or pay attention to what I might be perceiving as climate change from looking at the day-to-day weather or so forth. I rely on data and statistical analysis for that, because individual events are individual events, and climate is the statistics of the weather. So you have to look at all the data together and identify long-term trends and separate out natural factors from human factors, understand whether those trends might continue and so forth. So in looking at the data, the change that has probably caught my eye the most would be number of 100-degree days in the state of Texas. There's been an upward trend in temperatures for the past 50 years, and over that time we've seen in most parts of the state the number of 100-degree days more than double. And that trend is expected to continue because it's rooted in the long-term trend of temperatures overall. Turns out, in Texas, most of the summertime days get up into the mid-upper 90s, and so couple of degrees of warming puts a lot of days over that threshold. And we actually in 2011 saw what I call double triples, over 100 days of over 100-degree temperatures in some locations in Texas. And unfortunately, that sort of thing will become more and more common going forward.
So, I grew up in Dallas, and I was born there in the early 60s. And I remember that, 100-degree days were kind of unusual. I mean, you might get a few every summer, it seemed like. I remember that sometime in the late 70s or early 80s, we had uh, a heat wave in Dallas, and it got up to like 105 or something like that. And that was so special. My dad took a videotape of a football game and put it in the VCR. He taped all the weather broadcasts that night because we were like, it's so shocking. 105 or 106, something like that. And I remember that tape, being in our closet for so many years with, that written on the side of it, and thinking, okay, that's such a anomaly, kind of event, but now it's not. And uh, to me, kind of a wake up call was there was I think it was 96 in February where it got up to 100 degrees in Austin. Um, and I was flying in from Washington, D.C. or someplace like that. And the airline pilot got on right before we landed. And he said, well, you're not going to believe this, but it's actually 101 degrees in Austin right now. And everybody on the plane, you could hear the groan. Um, but like you say, 100 degrees is kind of, it's like I don't think people, you know, get too excited about that when they hear that in the summer now.
Yeah, I guess the year you're referring to was probably 1980, which really stands out like a sore hot thumb in Texas records. And it was extremely isolated. There wasn't anything like it for the preceding 30 years, and we made it another 20 years or so before coming close to duplicating it. The period back in the 1930s sort of was the high water mark for heat waves within the central U.S., but we're creeping up to that. If you look at the hottest days of the month in the summertime, we're now up to that level and moving past it. Yeah, those extremely hot years are becoming relatively common.
So I imagine as the state climatologist, not only have you observed some extreme events, but you probably studied some of the extreme events for Texas over the past decades. Can you tell us about some of those events like Hurricane Harvey and others that might not come to mind? I mean, I know that there were like crazy amounts of rainfall in Thrall, Texas, in the I can't remember the 20s or something like that. But I know Harvey was seemed like it was a wake up call and create a whole bunch of records.
Yeah, the history of weather in Texas is a series of wake up calls. Unfortunately,
Yeah, yeah.
people keep going back to sleep again. But let's
Oh,
see that. So let's see, Indianola hurricanes in 1876, 1875, and 1888. That was a major port along the Gulf Coast that nobody's heard of because there wasn't any high ground nearby, so it basically got wiped out twice, and people wised up and moved to Galveston, and Galveston got wiped out. But
oh,
change of approach in how to deal with natural disasters in Texas, build back better, so to speak. So they raised the level of Galveston, and now you won't get a repeat of 1900 from that particular location. But you notice the thing that happens is that's the only town along the Texas coast that did that because that was the only town that was hit by the 1900 hurricane. So we have resilience that gets built back in to places that got hit by natural disasters, but somehow people nearby don't seem to recognize that they were lucky that time that it's not going to hit them again. So
right.
with Hurricane Harvey, record totals for 2-day, 3-day rainfall values, 40, 50 plus inches in places. And Houston turned around and said, wow, climate change is a really big thing. And so they've changed their building standards and so forth. But on the one hand, Hurricane Harvey was so far outside of normal that it's not something we're likely to see again for centuries, even with climate change. So that event made Houston more resilient to climate change because they basically took that event as a sign of climate change. But take a place like Dallas hasn't had anything like a Harvey scale event, so they haven't implemented the same sorts of resiliency measures for building codes and so forth. So the trouble is these events are going to happen. You don't know where they're going to happen, and they are more likely with climate change. But as I tell people with hurricanes, if you're ready for a hurricane without climate change, that's 90% of the battle already.
Hmm.
Now, if
Well,
you go back to Hill Country, you mentioned the Thrall 1921, which was the record for one-day rainfall in the United States for 50 some odd years until another tropical storm came along in the Houston area and broke that record.
Alvin.
Right. But the record that catches my eye in Texas is 21 inches in less than 3 hours near D'Hanis, the southern part of the Hill Country. It's a rainfall rate sustained of about 8 inches an hour. And I didn't believe that very, very much. I knew people took it credibly, but didn't really believe it until 2015 when I had my car parked at the airport in Austin, and the LCR gauge near Austin reported a rain rate of 8 inches per hour.
Mm.
And I wondered whether my car would be found somewhere downstream. Fortunately, it was okay, but the weather station at the airport, the electronics were all underwater, so you never got good data out of that particular station.
Gosh. And let me just go back and say, I meant to say I think, Tropical Storm Claudette near Alvin.
Right.
Is
Yep.
Yeah. So Dehanus, what year was that?
That was 1935, I think. It was definitely in the 1930s. It was they didn't have, it was at a ranch, Woodward Ranch, that was up, in the middle of the hills. It was based on, like buckets filling with water, that sort of thing. It was a
Hmm.
reliable observation. It was supported by other observations nearby. It was supported by the flood that resulted because the stream that those floodwaters flowed into got so full. Not only did it overflow its banks, it overflowed its drainage basin and sent water into the next stream over.
Gosh. Well, obviously the one that is fresh in everybody's mind right now is the most recent extreme event, and of course I'm talking about the July 4th flooding on the Guadalupe River and I guess the Colorado River. Um, can you describe the factors in the atmosphere that came together to produce that event?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, anytime you have a record-setting event, it takes a lot of things lining up. We did a study a few years back looking at all of the uh, rainstorms in Texas that have produced at least 20 inches, and there were a lot of them. You wouldn't be able to do that study in most other states, but we were able to do it in Texas. And they tended to happen either in late spring, May, June, maybe early July, or in the fall. And the ones in the spring were sort of tropical. Sometimes it'd actually be a tropical disturbance that makes landfall. In the September October timeframe, it could be a slow-moving tropical storm, or it could be what we call an upper-level trough coming in from the west that produces the rainfall and acts on this the air that has so much humidity in it because sea surface temperatures are peaking at that time. But the common denominator with all of them was winds blowing from south to north at the ground level, a mile up, 2 miles up, 3 miles up, so forth, tapping into tropical moisture at all levels in the atmosphere. And what that does is it means that the atmosphere is not fighting against thunderstorms. Under normal conditions, a cloud's going up, it's got sharp edges because the air around it is dry, and so some of that water in the cloud is evaporating, it's cooling the air, and a thunderstorm thrives on heat. So that tends to make it harder for the storm to develop. Rainwater can evaporate on the way down. It can produce a cold outflow that can shut off the inflow to the storm. And that's all what happens in a normal thunderstorm. But when the whole atmosphere is wet and you still have instability, that thunderstorm can just keep producing rainfall. Rainfall is made what we call very efficiently because almost all the condensation reaches the ground, and it doesn't cut itself off from new inflows of moisture. So that something we saw in the case of the Guadalupe River floods as well. We had remnants of Tropical Storm Barry, which had made landfall on the Gulf Coast of northern Mexico, and that was drifting northward. And at the same time, there was a hurricane in the East Pacific called Flossie, and circulation counterclockwise around that means you had southerly flow bringing moisture across the mountains of Mexico into the higher levels of the atmosphere in Texas. So we had that moisture present, and then there was just a weak disturbance that came along in the jet stream to help trigger things. And because the moisture was actually coming from slightly different angles, that means that we also had what we call wind shear, which allows for a new storm to replace an existing storm as the existing storm moves away. And there were a few spots in the hill country, including the South Fork of the Guadalupe River. We had that sort of what we call a training echo pattern, where it's like one train car after another moving over the same location, dumping its load of water. So it was like, three thunderstorms very efficiently rain producing, one after the other, dumping on that watershed. So that was what was going on in the atmosphere to contribute to that flood. Obviously, things happening on the ground mattered as well.
So, you mentioned that Texas has a lot of these 20-inch events, rainfall events. And, I was just thinking about the during the time that I was working for the River Authority, which manages most of the Guadalupe River, not the upper part, Kerr County, where the flood was worse recently. Um, but it seemed like we had a flood in that basin about every 10 years, and it was usually in a different spot. It might be down at Wimberley in 2015, or from San Marcos all the way down to the coast in 98. And then, there's other ones in 87, and in even, what is it? I think I'm trying to remember, 2002, when the water went over the spillway at Canyon and carved the gorge below the spillway. Uh, and and I guess some of that's related to the topography. I know. I mean, you've got the escarpment, and you've got a lot of hills with limestone and thin soils, and not a whole lot of vegetation, and that water, I guess, starts. If it starts up near Hunt, it's at 1,800 feet, and by the time it's rushed downhill to New Braunfels, it's at 600 feet. So it's close to 600 feet. So it's gone downhill, and gained a lot of speed. Uh, it just seems like, uh, you know, that portion of the hill country, the Guadalupe and the upper San Antonio and upper Colorado River, they're really kind of designed for these really bad floods, in some way, and they seem to get their share of them.
Yeah, they've got all the ingredients in place. You've got the topographic slope that means that things run off quickly, and if you have flooding, the floodwaters are moving. I think we all remember the picture from Hurricane Harvey in 2017, looking down the street and all these boats and people waiting around and all the water rescues. There was a whole lot more water in Hurricane Harvey than there was in the Guadalupe River flood, but the loss of life was much lower because all you had to worry about was the water level and staying above it. You weren't actually getting homes dislodged and people knocked off their feet while they were evacuating and that sort of thing. So yeah, the slope of the land makes the flooding more dangerous in the hill country. The shallowness of the soils means that water doesn't soak into the ground. Just about everything that falls is available to produce a flood, and it's the first obstacle of topography that the moist air from the Gulf of Mexico is going to hit. We're sitting on the west edge of the Atlantic Ocean basin, and the way the atmosphere works, that's where the air tends to be moving most strongly from south to north. So we're right in the target zone for that, and the hill country is the first obstacle, so it tends to trigger thunderstorms, and perfect sort of setup. The only thing that sort of works against lots of floods here is probably northern Mexico, which is a source of dry air aloft. So most of the time we don't have those high moisture conditions that are conducive to flood, but they do certainly happen. And the rainfall totals that you get just under normal circumstances along that strip of land from San Antonio to Del Rio and up toward the Guadalupe River is higher than any place farther north or farther south, just because of that, what we call the Balcones escarpment, that obstacle that allows for the extra push of the air upward to help form a thunderstorm.
I keep thinking about this term that I've heard a lot the last few weeks, flash flood alley, and I keep thinking, well, I guess that's an Nueces, upper Nueces River Basin in San Antonio and Guadalupe in Colorado, but I don't really know. I mean, I'm never quite sure where Tornado Alley is. It seems everybody seems to say, "Oh, I'm in Tornado Alley," and I'm in Tornado. I never really know, right? But I'm curious: is that really a thing? Flash flood alley?
It's a thing. Yeah, people do define it in different ways. I've seen it sketched out from San Antonio to Dallas. I don't buy that. I don't put Dallas in Flash Flood Alley. But on the other hand, you can go a lot farther west from it. There's been flash flooding as far as Sanderson, Del Rio. Those areas are sort of the same situation as San Antonio and Austin. You've got in that case, the Rio Grande and the Pecos River, are actually moving down the terrain fairly rapidly. The soils are dry. It's all part of the Edwards Plateau with the limestone base that doesn't allow for much absorption of water. So I basically go from Del Rio to San Antonio and up to Austin, and then inland from there about 100 miles until the terrain starts leveling out again.
I sometimes think about those events in that region, and it seems like every 10 years or so there's a really terrible flood. Maybe not quite every 10 years, but I often think maybe that's one of the reasons why people get caught off guard is that a lot of people moving into Texas, and they in the time that they've lived here, they may be new to the hill country and they've never seen a flood like that, and it's been fairly dry much of the time that they've been in the state, and it's kind of a shock that these kind of events happen there. um, and when we use these terms, like, I know we don't use this anymore, and I heard people saying 100-year flood. I'm like, 1% flood. uh, even those terms, I will often kind of wonder how well those really describe or apply to some of the areas that we're talking about. It seems like uh, that maybe even that is maybe not the best way to characterize that area anymore.
Yeah, I'm in the minority in my discipline. I actually like the concept of a 100-year flood because I think the number 100 is easier for people to understand than the number 1%. But if either way, you're going to get these misconceptions. One common issue I have is first off, I think people expect that a 100-year flood or 1% annual chance of a flood means that they'll only see one of those in maybe a century on average, which is true. But the definition of those is an event at that same exact location. You can have You're going to have many 100-year floods in the United States in any given year, just because there's lots of places in the United States. If you say there's 10,000 river basins that can flood, then you expect to see on average 100-year floods in just a single year. And of course, the number will vary a lot. So people sometimes get caught off guard by seeing multiple occasions of this, but that's something you expect. That means also, for example, you can't necessarily say that just because the rainfall exceeded the 100-year rainfall amount in a portion of the Guadalupe River Basin that doesn't mean that the flood on the Guadalupe River was a 100-year flood, because you could get the same rainfall total next year in a different part of the basin, and it could produce the same magnitude flood, and it would demonstrate that the odds of that flood was actually higher than 1% in any given year. The hydrologists are going to be simulating this event and figuring out how it ranks in sort of the flood totals, and there are ways in which you try to estimate flood levels from the rainfall analyses, but it's a rather inexact science, so that part does get difficult. And frankly speaking, as a meteorologist, I was shocked when I learned how crudely standard practice was in going from a 100-year rainfall amount to a 100-year flood amount. In meteorology, we got lots of gauge observations from rain gauges, and we can do statistical analysis of it. That's great, but obviously, for a flood, it's going to matter. Well, how long was the rainfall event in a given basin? How widely distributed was it? How wet was the ground beforehand? All those factors are going to enter into the rainfall amount at a particular time. I was surprised to learn that the way that standard practice is, you assume some standard time evolution of the rainfall. You assume some standard basin characteristics, and you just go with it. Hopefully, in the future, as we get more and more radar data throughout the United States, you'll be able to basically test lots of different storms and lots of different locations within the basin and come up with a better statistical analysis based on these storms rather than individual point rainfall totals and estimates from there on out that build uncertainty upon uncertainty to get the flood frequency analysis.
So do you see anything coming out of this specific storm that's going to require some rethinking on all that?
I don't know. I think it probably was the frequency of the flood in this case was probably not too far off from a 1 in 100, 1 in 200 year event. I don't think it was 1 in 1,000 because I think the basin came pretty close to this during an event in the 1930s. There's that decade again. It was quite a decade to live through. It wasn't the same event that produced the 21 inches either. And as you mentioned, we see floods frequently, and there are only so many rivers in the hill country. So I don't think we really know what the upper limit is on flood possibilities within that region. And the challenge for people there is not just that they're not familiar with it, but you could have gone to the Guadalupe River a month ago and looked at it and imagine, gee, a flood might actually bring the water level up a few feet. But this thing is such a pretty river. It's so benign. It's flowing between these trees. It's obviously just sort of a creek. We call it a river, but it's a creek. You just float down. It's like the Mississippi River. And so you get a rain like we had, and you get Mississippi River flows in that tiny channel.
Right. It's really unbelievable. I've been thinking about this from a water management point of view. We used to talk a lot about the concept of probable maximum flood, which I guess is the largest flood that could potentially occur at a specific location, estimated based on the maximum possible precipitation. Is there really, what is the limit to how bad a flood can be?
Yeah, well, speaking from first principles, there's only so much water on the planet, so there's got to be a limit as to how much rainfall you can get in a given period of time. It's probably somewhere less than the NOAA account, but could be potentially high. I mean, when I think about the way we go about estimating that typically is basically try to find, okay, what are some of the big rainfall totals in our region, and then say, okay, well, if the humidity was as high as it ever gets, how much wetter would that have been? And you basically are hoping that you've had a few storms that have reached that some sort of upper limit as to the maximum production of rainfall that could happen. But then I think back to an example like the Kerr County flood, where you had basically 3 to 4 inches an hour for 1 hour, and then new storm forms another hour, and new storm forms you get another hour. And I can't tell you any meteorological process would be guaranteed to stop that after 3 hours. It seems like it's physically possible to maintain a 4-inch rainfall total per hour for an entire day, and that would give you 100 inches of rain in a day, which we've never seen. But that doesn't mean it's not possible. It's just extremely, extremely unlikely. So based on that, I was on a National Academy of Science committee that looked at how to deal with this concept of probable maximum precipitation, because you have to design for something. If you're putting in a dam like Canyon Dam, you don't want it to ever fail, but you probably don't have to make it 1,000 feet high either. So you have to figure out, well, what's the appropriate standard? And gee, it was nice to say, well, we'll design it higher than anything that's possible, as long as what's possible is some manageable number. But if that's not manageable, we have to move toward basically some sort of risk-based approach and say, well, let's think 1 in a million is probably a reasonable safeguard, and we'll try to estimate that probability. Now you've got a problem. You don't have a million years worth of data, and if you did, it wouldn't help anyhow, because the climate has only been the climate like we've had it for maybe 10,000 years or so forth, and it's changing. So down the road, I could envision, and what the committee envisioned is basically trying to do massive, long simulations of rainfall. Maybe use AI models, which can run very quickly these days, and basically get millions of years worth of storms, and actually see, well, how much rainfall could you actually get with a 1 in a million chance, and then plug that into a hydrologic model. How much stream flow do you get out of that sort of thing? But humans do much better with bright lines and say, okay, this dam is designed to prevent any flood that's possible. They're much less comfortable with a 1 in a million or a 1 in 10 million chance, because in that case it's obvious that some occasion it's possible that dam could actually fail. And we have seen dams fail around the world that were designed to a reasonable standard. So, unfortunately, nothing is perfectly safe.
Well, and we're fickle creatures too, because there are a lot of dams I know that were built after big floods, and then they didn't have a big flood for 20 or 30 years, and there were a lot of complaining about why they build that dam, and so that can be kind of a challenge too, when you look at some of the floods we've had out in the western part of the state, and some of those dams that are sitting there and they're kind of perpetually low all the time. I know that was you kind of look back in the records when we were in the big dam building era in the 60s and 70s, and some of the justification for some of the dams, and you think, I wonder if that kind of event's going to happen again, where the hurricane comes up the mouth of the river and goes all the way up, the top of the watershed or something, and you get this incredible amount of rain. Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, those reservoirs are getting smaller as sediment flows into them. So the amount they can hold is smaller. And we also did a study on what computer model projections show about river flow in the state of Texas, and we don't know whether those projections have come true, but they're certainly a possible scenario. And what they tend to show is on most months, the stream flows in the major rivers are going to be less than they are presently. Soils will be drier, even if you have the same amount of rainfall. Evaporation rates are higher, and so you end up with less water making it into rivers, and so there's less water reliably coming into the reservoirs, except that extreme rainfall is increasing. And so you occasionally get these very wet periods where you have high stream flow, and those values actually projected to increase. And so whatever standard the reservoirs were built for, whatever flood they were designed to prevent, they're now being able to hold less water because of the sedimentation. And the chances of that flood happening is greater than it used to be because of the warming climate. So the safety margin is being eaten away from both sides.
Well, you mentioned sedimentation. These lakes. The Texas Water Journal just published an article not too long ago by authors at the Water Development Board, looking at sedimentation curves for reservoirs in Texas. So you kind of also touched on this question here, that, hey, are we going to see more of these kind of events going forward, or maybe less than we've seen in the past, or about the same? I mean, any thoughts on that?
Well, again, it's going to circle back on what we mean by kind of event. If if a flood flows down a canyon and nobody's living there, is that
Yeah,
the same kind of event?
right.
I could refer specifically to flooding in the Devil's River, which is a river maybe most Texans haven't heard of, but it's a bigger river than the Guadalupe in terms of size and drainage area, and it's been subject to large flooding. But the difference is it's farther west, it's drier, people don't live there, it's not as pretty, and so the flood that occurs doesn't lead to a natural disaster. Other people have made this point. Natural disasters are not natural disasters. They're only natural disasters because humans are interacting with them.
Hmm.
And to that extent, I think people are at least going to be more careful about building near streams in the hill country, at least in the near future. They're going to be more aware of this hazard. And society is going to take action to make this sort of disaster where you have over 100 people losing their lives less likely. The atmosphere itself doesn't care about that. The atmosphere is going to be producing heavy rain, and the I can't say, specifically what the trend is going to be in any particular river basin because natural variability is such a big factor in Texas climate. But we've analyzed rainfall extremes across the whole south and southeast United States to smooth average out natural variability and figure out what's the underlying trend. And what we see in specifically 100-year rainfall amounts that with over a day's period of time accumulation, those numbers have gone up by about 15% in terms of the amount of rainfall that you expect to see in a 100-year event over the past several decades. You can find places where the trend has been down. You can find traces where the trend has been very large. In the hill country, it's actually been pretty close to that rate of about 15% over several decades. And some of that is climate change. Some of that's natural variability. We certainly can't attribute it all to natural variability because there's very good reason for climate change to cause an increase of extreme rainfall. The warmer the atmosphere, the more water it can hold. And if you think back to what produces floods in Texas, it's when you get moisture at all levels in the atmosphere. So the atmosphere is at its carrying capacity for moisture. And if its carrying capacity is higher, then the same storm system will produce more rainfall at a higher rate. Climate change could also change the structure of storms. Probably not a big impact on individual thunderstorms. It could affect hurricanes, make them more compact, so more intense rainfall over a smaller area. Climate change can also change the frequency of weather patterns. Probably not a big impact on this type of weather pattern that we saw. So put those together, you would expect to have seen something like a 5 or 10% increase of extreme rainfall over that period. We've seen 15% increase. We've seen average rainfall totals increase over that period as well, so that's probably part of it. But the expectation, the amount you should plan on the odds of happening is going up, is going to continue to keep going up. Whether you're going to be lucky enough to avoid a trend in your lifetime or not, that's up to the randomness of the weather.
Well, I want to make sure I note here that while we're doing this interview, but discussing this topic, that the Texas legislature is in a special session, and as the result of the floods starting on the 4th, they're looking at flooding and flood preparedness during the session, and so we'll see what the legislature comes up with in terms of trying to make us better prepared for the next event like this, which who knows when that's going to happen.
Yeah, and we're doing some work on that. Congress a few years back ordered the federal government to essentially analyze these 1-in-100-year events in the context of ongoing trends in the frequency and intensity. And one part of that was going to be looking at historical trends, one part looking at future trends from climate models. And with the new administration in place, they basically pulled the plug on the future part. The general skepticism about all things climate change related, and that was definitely a part of it. But at least according to what we heard of a few days ago, the funding has been restored.
Oh, good.
The timing looks an awful lot like it was inspired by the Guadalupe River flooding and the basic awareness that whatever is causing this trend, you don't have to believe in the cause, but you do have to deal with the consequences. And we have to be prepared to have infrastructure that is designed for the climate moving forward, not the historical climate. In Texas, we were funded by the Texas Water Development Board to do a Texas-sized study, again looking at trends in extreme rainfall. And we're doing a couple of different techniques, which are probably too technical to talk about in this forum, but that'll be a separate set of numbers, separate set of estimates to be available for engineers to use, for emergency managers to use, that will be taking into account the trends that we've seen and the trends that are being projected.
When do you think that information will be available?
We're shooting for having some preliminary numbers out for internal review in a couple of months, and the whole thing should be done and available to the public by the end of the year.
Gotcha. So, John, we're now down to the last question, and this question is, hey, how can our listeners find out more about your work as a state climatologist and your work at Texas A&M?
Well, I'm not a big social media guy, but we do have students, so they help populate our Facebook, X, and Blue Sky accounts. They're all under the rubric of Climate Texas, a merger of the climate and Texas, with the overlapping letters together. We do weekly updates of what's been happening within the state of Texas in terms of climate. We've also been commissioned by a nonprofit called Texas 2036 to look at trends in extreme weather over the longer term, and our report's available on their website, Texas 2036/weather, be the place to get hold of it. My email and phone are publicly available, so if anybody has particular weather or climate questions, they can certainly get hold of me. My mission is to help the state of Texas and its citizens make the best possible use of weather and climate information, so we're here to help.
Great. Well, I will put a link to your website and all that in some of the notes for our discussion today.
All right, thanks.
So that'll be one way people can find you. So, John, thank you for joining me today. I mean, I really enjoyed this, and I know you must be really, really busy after what happened at the beginning of the month. So thanks for taking time out to talk to me.
Yeah, my pleasure.
This has been Talk Plus Water, and my guest today was Professor John Nielsen-Gammon, a Regents Professor of Atmospheric Sciences at Texas A&M University, who serves as the State Climatologist and the Director of the Southern Regional Climate Center. I want to thank you, the listener, for spending your valuable time on this podcast. Finally, I want to give a big thank you to Anna Huff at the Meadows Center for Water and the Environment at Texas State University for getting this episode of Talk Plus Water ready to flow. If you enjoy our discussion today, please subscribe to the podcast and leave us a review to let us know how we did. And if you want to take it to another level, you can support Talk Plus Water through our account on Patreon. My name is Todd Bottler. Let's talk water again soon.